Hello, good evening. Tilt this up a little bit. Find some way to occupy the podium simultaneously. Thank you very much to the Architectural League for having us, and it's a pleasure to be with Interboro again, who we, I guess, shared the stage with in 2005, and we've been following them, doing some detective work, snooping around and seeing what they're doing. We haven't installed cameras yet, but we're working on it. So it's great to be with them, good friends and colleagues from the GSD, and any excuse to come back to New York, always welcome. So we're going to try in 40 minutes or less to show 3 projects, and but we wanted to use this opportunity to be public about a kind of anxiety, or let's say an observation we have about the discipline, partly as a way to, I guess it's a kind of couch thing, self-analysis, to understand where we might position ourselves. So I'm going to start, and we'll find some way to pass it back and forth. We had something worked out, but we're already doing it differently than we planned. And this seems like always a great place to start, because this is Charles Jenks in 1971 making a 30-year prediction on the discipline, making a 30-year prediction. He was drawing here, but projecting here. And he, of course, revisited this later in 2000 or 2001 and did a kind of updated version where he inserted other gray blobs that were the facts. And so here is the kind of fictive version of 30 years. And 2 things I think are central here to what we observe. One is that the discipline itself is a sort of living entity. So it is not a fixed entity, but in fact always morphing and bleeding and oozing into one spot. Maybe it should or shouldn't be. And has a kind of ambiguous condition at the edges along the timeline. The other one is that architecture doesn't really exist in here. The word architecture doesn't exist anywhere within this field, and yet it is about architecture. It's actually called Architecture 2000, Predictions and Methods. So we found that really interesting, is that you don't actually, I mean, that's probably obvious, but you don't have to state the discipline. The discipline status is embedded within other terminologies somewhere. And so similar, maybe 8 years later, you have Rosalind Krauss, and we find this to be a key moment and a moment of interest to our practice or our status within the discipline, or this idea about being after discipline, is Rosalind Krauss set up a relationship between landscape, architecture, and sculpture, because she'd observed that the practice of sculpture had been problematized, and its status, let's say when somebody's cutting a pure rectangle in the earth, and is that sculpture, what is it? And so her exercise, I'm paraphrasing here embarrassingly for any art historians in the room, was to locate it within this Klein diagram. And so sculpture really became a result of being not architecture and not landscape. So its status disciplinarily was located within that. But then it opened up this other condition of what is landscape, what is architecture, and she furthers that by locating other relationships between, let's say, architecture and not architecture. You end up with these 3 sub-practices of sculpture. So sculpture exists within this periphery, she's arguing, and these other disciplines that she's rubbing elbows with and jockeying with are landscape and architecture. So we see a similar status, a similar anxiety present in our discipline today. Number one, we knew that architecture does not own the term design, but what's now become present and probably frightening is we no longer own the term architect. This goes against all of our preconceptions. I'm going to show you 3 headlines from the last 9 months virtually from the New York Times. So if the New York Times is using it, we know we've got an issue. Euro's architect warns about currency's future. Apparently the person that has conceived of the euro is an architect. Pfizer's chief, architect of its mega merger, retires. So now a chief executive is an architect. Boehner hires contract architect to promote GOP platform. So here, even in politics, you have an architect. And notice here that contract is in quotes and architect is not. So I think we have a problem. And like all problems, we probably should learn to live with it or find some way to coexist or occupy or maneuver within it. So I want to set that on one side. On the other side, I want to point out this really fascinating moment in 2009 when on the cover, again, the New York Times, great resource, even in Canada. This is the cover of the architecture issue in 2009. This is the architecture issue. Giant bold letters, infrastructure. This is the alternative cover that didn't make the cut. And equally fascinating is the fine print, which says it's more exciting than you think, actually. So here, this idea that this is the stuff we've got to deal with. This is what we have to do. Now we can build a bridge, a high-speed rail, broadband, lots more. This is what we have to do. This is our task at hand, according to 2009. And it's actually quite exciting. They're telling us that, oh, don't worry, it'll be fun. And I think this is an interesting moment. So and it has proven to be. There's a lot of fascinating case studies. But the introduction of this term, infrastructure, into our discipline, I think offers a problem, and I'd say maybe even greater anxiety. Because where within our field, as landscape becomes more urban, as urban design wants to be more architecture, more like architecture, and as architects want to be more landscapey, I think we've got a soup cooking here of all of these disciplines. So if this is what Rosalind Krauss was doing in 1979, I think our task is to position this term. So I'm going to set up an opposition that previously Krauss had, of course, architecture, and that was convenient for her to absorb it within the idea of defining sculpture. But if we want to define infrastructure, I think we have to remove architecture from the equation in order to locate it somewhere else. And so we've set up landscape, urbanism, and infrastructure. And infrastructure, loosely speaking, being the result of being not landscape and not urbanism. And that opens up the field yet again. And we're calling these terms that it opens up to, if Krauss had axiomatic structures, site construction, and marked sites, we're offering the possibility of productive surface, civic conduit, and a programmed container. So in fact, architecture exists within this larger periphery, but it's not named. And it has with it now, we bolded the term surface, container, and conduit because they think they carry properties of architecture that we would embrace and say exists within this soupy mix that we have now, and then offered other characteristics like civic in terms of this idea of landscape and urbanism, productive in terms of something being landscape, not landscape, and something being programmed when something is urbanism, not urbanism. And so anyway, we think this is an important moment to define and qualify increasingly as terms like multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary. They all sound like some kind of gender change or something going on, but we think this is an opportune moment. And further to that, as a kind of super expanded field maybe, the idea that within the periphery of all of these are things that maybe have no disciplinary bounds at all, and in fact are things that all of these share, which are energies, economies, ecologies, and velocities.
So, as I said, the Salton sort of in the 1920s was actually the kind of Riviera of California. Marilyn Monroe would go there, James Dean. It was sort of hugely successful. In the 50s, they started to stock fish species, and so it became a kind of major recreational area. It was a huge area for regattas for boats because the boats would go incredibly fast because of the hypersalinity. And then in the 60s, all the way through the 90s, it started to go into a sort of state of significant ecological decline. Basically because of all the agricultural chemicals sort of suddenly increasing in concentration. And so there were massive fish die-offs, massive bird die-offs, and essentially the kind of, the sea is now in a kind of ecological tipping point. So here you see the kind of landscape of the Imperial Valley in the south, the sort of the kind of classic American agricultural landscape. Here's a sort of defunct, many of these motels that sort of had their glory days in the 50s, and then this massive fish die-off and the kind of huge toxicity in the region. And so so California has until 2018 to do something, because, as I say, the lake's in a kind of about to kind of tip ecologically into massive decline. All the species will start to die off. the lake bed will start to expose itself, and you'll have a kind of condition like Owens Lake, which many of you probably know was a kind of poster child for what happened in California with the manipulation of water infrastructure. And so most projects and most solutions that have been put forth by engineers and by the California government sort of take the conditions of the Salton as a kind of thing to be accepted, and are relying on I don't know if one can say conventional, but certainly sort of highly engineered technological fixes. So ideas of partitioning the sea, as you see there, and saying that we'll salvage part of the sea and the rest we'll just let to dry up. Ideas about pumping water all the way from the Pacific through massive canals, which are sort of, I mean, the costs are tremendous, of course, of that. And what we became interested in was the question of, could one actually sort of accept the conditions of salinity and this kind of slightly mutant environment as a kind of opportunity? And could one actually take this liability to start to imagine new economies, start to kind of restore or kind of intervene in a more incremental way, and so that water infrastructure no longer became a kind of massive engineering project, but something that could be responsive and incremental. And so here you see a kind of aerial view of a kind of first stage of the project, which basically involved populating. Well, actually, sorry, so I'll pause for a moment on this diagram. So this is really sort of talking about this idea of a kind of new economy and a new kind of maybe life cycle for the Salton. So if the current condition of the Salton is one of a kind of mono economy, which is entirely dependent really on the Imperial Valley, and the Salton is really just a kind of aqueous dump and isn't seen as really having any value at the moment, we were interested in saying, could one start to kind of restore the Salton as a kind of economic generator through a kind of restoration, but also kind of generating new economies that would sort of feed off this kind of saline condition. So certain species of fish, certain growing kelp, growing seaweed, and other things that kind of naturally take place in very saline conditions. So here's a kind of something between a master plan maybe and a sort of flow diagram for the Salton, which looks at the idea of sort of creating three new regions: an industrial production region in the east, a kind of ecological zone in the south to kind of serve partly as remediation, and a kind of recreation zone in what was historically the Salton city. And as I said, the sort of idea was to kind of populate the Salton through a series of salinity regulating pools that could also start to take on other functions. But the kind of larger agenda, I would say, is also to start to reconnect the Salton to a kind of larger network. So ideas that it could now start to export some of these products. It could start to produce fresh water that could be exported. It would start to harvest salt in sort of return to its namesake, and that would become a new industry that would start to export. So the kind of idea of sort of re-expanding the kind of role of the Salton. So the kind of components of the project are the Salton Sea itself, a kind of new shoreline, these infrastructural ponds, and a kind of new land-based program. So there are four pool types. A production pool, as I said, that starts to harvest things like fish, kelp, algae. A harvesting pool that starts to, through passive solar desalination, harvest fresh water and salt. A habitat pool that would start to kind of sustain fish and bird species, and recreation pools that would start to kind of take advantage of these different salinities for different recreational activities. And the idea is that the pools have different sizes based on their function, and particularly different depths. So shallower pools will obviously evaporate more quickly, and deeper pools will evaporate more slowly. And so the kind of their ability to regulate the salinity in that sense is sort of corresponds to the kind of depth of the pools. And the other idea is that the pools could start to aggregate to form sort of ecologies. So you might take harvesting pools and of salt and fresh water, and recreation pools. And so the fresh water from one could start to be sort of transferred to another one. So the idea that they would start to kind of form micro-landscapes within the Salton itself. So here's a kind of view of the new land-based programs that really were, and the kind of new shoreline that could receive the pools for either maintenance and to once there was sort of salt or water that needed to be harvested. And then on the land, there was water treatment, salt drying beds, some fish farming and whatnot. So there's a kind of new landscape that emerges or new industry that emerges on the land that is no longer as water consumptive as a kind of existing condition. So here's a view of the industrial region with some of the kind of salt and water ponds coming in for harvest. In the south, as I was saying, was the kind of ecology zone. There's already actually quite a few wetlands. Sonny Bono took a love to the Salton Sea from Sharon Bono. And so there's a national park named after him there. And so the idea is to kind of amplify a condition that's already happening. And basically the water that is entering the Salton that's sort of generating the toxicity is the New River and the Alamo River. And so the idea is to start to kind of treat that before it enters the Salton. So you start to kind of tackle the problem, as a kind of first stage. And then a kind of view of this new recreational landscape with the different salinity recreational pools. And this is a view or a kind of diagram of us starting to speculate on how the water harvesting would work. So as I said, the idea is through passive solar desalination, the water would evaporate and then collect in the kind of rings, and once full would be brought to shore to harvest. And a lot of this is actually, I mean, the whole idea of the pools, the idea of the kind of passive desalination is actually really playing off a lot of existing technology. So there's Norway's looking at these sort of huge sort of balloons to transport water from water-rich regions to arid regions. So it's kind of playing off existing technologies and really just trying to recalibrate them. So this is going back to this idea of a kind of expanded now economy for the Salton, from what was once a kind of fairly singular one. And really the kind of project is interested in this idea of taking infrastructure, and particularly water infrastructure in this case, and expanding its kind of role into one that starts to sustain ecologies, that starts to sustain or generate new economies and become perhaps more entrepreneurial than we've tended to think about infrastructure projects in the past, and starting to create a kind of new public realm. And this idea that could infrastructure start to be incremental and responsive and adaptive rather than something that has to happen at a kind of massive scale all at once, and hence start to kind of think about life cycles and kind of future lives and other possibilities that emerge from the project itself. Okay. We'll try and keep this short. So the last project we're going to show is called Next North, and it's a ongoing, and as Mason pointed out, perhaps unfinishable project that looks at, it picks up partly on the kind of project of Icelink and a competition that we did for in Iceland 2-3 years ago, and it looks at a kind of whole set of issues confronting the Canadian North, but actually the entire circumpolar region. The myth of the Canadian North is tied to its unique geography. It's a territory which is vast, sparsely populated, fragile, and sublime. Yet it's also one of the most dramatically changing climates on Earth, and it has an estimated quarter of the planet's undiscovered energy resources. And so it's emerged as a site of significant economic and developmental speculation. And of course, the melting of the polar ice has intensified territorial land claims, access to resources, access to potential shipping routes, but it's also threatening ecosystems and ways of life. And so it's a sort of highly contested territory, of course. And so, so here's a kind of classic view of the Canadian North that Canadians in particular love to romanticize. And so in this context, particularly the current Canadian government, but actually the Russian government, the Swedish government, all the kind of circumpolar governments are proclaiming aggressive national sovereignty stance. And particularly in Canada, there's been declarations that we're going to have deep sea ports and we're going to have more submarines. And of course, none of this has seen the day, not least because if you know the Canadian military, we wouldn't be very far without the U.S. And so here's a kind of the sort of famed Northwest Passage, which is incredibly significant in terms of trade routes, because right now ships have to go all the way south, and by being able to take this route, they cut off about a week on the shipping route. So it's quite significant in that regard as well. But what we really got interested in beyond the kind of geopolitical is that there's a rapidly growing population, partly because of resources, partly because it's very young, and there's really no one who's looking at how settlement will start to happen, how urbanism might happen, and there's really never been an idea of a kind of uniquely northern urbanism. Historically, we've always imported southern models of urbanism, of education, of health, et cetera. And so part of the project asks, how can one develop a kind of what we're calling a kind of hyper-vernacular and a kind of very specific context. So very quickly, it's an incredibly dispersed network of settlements, which is one of the challenges. Typically very small settlements, often 500 to 1,000 people, living in essentially no connectivity other than plane for the most part. So in many regions, there are no roads. So here are sort of studies of some of the settlement patterns. And as I said, a kind of very rapidly growing and very young population. So I'll let you.
And then just because of the scale of the project, we started a delicious tag system where, as the four of us were building out the research and two of our staff members, that we could easily start to keep track of that through tags. And so as we would find things, and we were trying to educate ourselves, I guess, in the last really year and a half, 2 years. Anyway, so that became a great public and kind of accessible forum that we could reach wherever we might be. And then that's begun to manifest itself, like the oblique strategies from Eno, as a kind of deck of cards that we used, and we categorized them by theme: ecology, settlements, culture, transportation, monitoring, and resources that were innate to that context, and use them to find, let's say, worthwhile dilemmas to look at within that context. And so we opened up an exhibition of some of this work just in January, and has just in the last 2 days taken that down. And it involved about 6 project proposals, and a digital interactive timeline, these research cards splayed on a wall that were also tagged to some of these projects, study models, and then this monstrous piece that took inordinate amounts of time, which is called the active layer. And this was our homage to the permafrost conditioned landscape, which is the kind of base layer of everything. Architecture cannot be built directly onto the ground because it will melt the permafrost and your building will sink into the earth slowly but surely. And the active layer also provides this amazingly accessible ground foraging material for caribou and other species that become primary protein source for Inuit and native populations there. So this is what it looks like. It's this kind of lunar, pockmarked landscape that happens as ice heaves and then collapses from underneath what you can tell is a sort of green condition, and it's just completely surreal and fantastic, and we wanted to replicate that. So we took that landscape and extrapolated into 25,000 points, and reconstructed a piece of that landscape as essentially a ground model, a site for the 6 projects. So the 6 projects, 6 propositions float, and you can tell whether they're on ice or on land or whether they use snow. We milled these foam pieces, and then plexiglass was representative of ice, and the sticks themselves were basically like deep piles of geology. And the blue are these little thermokarst pockets, these pools of water and ice that shift between the. So these are examples of some of these projects on the active layer in the exhibition.